He just wanted some peace and quiet on his farm. But his sheepdog found a bus buried underground that had been missing for 15 years. The veteran called a crane and realized that someone had been watching him all this time. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The morning came slowly over the edge of the hills, spilling pale gold across the trees and the silent, abandoned fields that surrounded the farm. It was the kind of dawn that usually brought peace to the land, the kind that softened the world and quieted the mind. But for Edward Hartman, standing on the sagging porch with a mug of cooling coffee, the quiet did not feel like comfort. It felt like a pause, a moment of breath before something unknown would shift the soil beneath his feet. He didn't yet know why he felt this way, but he had lived enough life, survived enough places where instincts meant survival, to trust that feeling. He had been living on the farm for barely 6 weeks. When he bought the property, it had been little more than a forgotten patch of land, advertised for a price so low it seemed almost suspicious. 50 acres of overgrown fields, a house that leaned slightly to one side, and a barn whose roof sagged under the weight of time. None of it looked promising to most people. But to Edward, the land's isolation was the only thing that mattered. The nearest neighbor lived 5 miles away through woods so thick that even local hunters avoided them. The roads leading to the property weren't even paved. And best of all, there was no traffic, no people, no memories pressing against him. Only quiet. The farm sat alongside an old rock quarry, once used for mining granite, but abandoned for more than a decade. The quarry had filled halfway with runoff water, leaving a long crescent of exposed stone, dirt, and half-rotten construction equipment at the bottom. No one came here anymore. No one cared. The company that once owned the land had dissolved years ago, leaving the valley in silence. Edward had explored the quarry several times during his first days here, taking note of the old crane sitting like a giant skeletal relic on its rusted tracks. Its engine was long dead, or so he assumed then. It was a hulking, forgotten thing, with weeds growing through its base and wind whistling through broken windows. But even that machine, with all its useless weight and worn-out bolts, had felt fitting to Edward. He liked dead things. They did not demand anything. They did not speak. He glanced down as a soft exhale brushed the side of his leg. The black shepherd sat by his boot, ears raised in alert. Raven was her name. He hadn't chosen it. She had come with that name when he adopted her from the K-9 retirement program. She had been difficult for the handlers to place, young, healthy, combat-trained, but considered unfit for civilian life due to the trauma she carried from one particular explosion overseas. Most families wanted a calm, stable, pensioned dog, not a creature who jolted awake in the middle of the night, trembling, or who scanned every room for danger before entering it. But the moment Edward saw her, sitting rigid and watchful behind the kennel bars, he had recognized the look in her eyes. He had once seen that same expression in the mirror. So he signed the papers, brought her home, and within days she became his shadow, moving quietly beside him, responding to every shift in his breathing, lying at the foot of his bed, like a guardian whose watch would never end. She trusted him in a way she trusted no one else, and he understood that trust with a depth he rarely discussed. They were both creatures returned from places they didn't speak about, both trying to exist in a world that had moved on without them. Broken, perhaps, but broken in the same shape. Raven nuzzled his hand now, then lifted her nose to the wind. Her posture changed, tightening from relaxed companionship to sharp, immediate attention. Edward straightened, following her gaze toward the track that wound down into the quarry. There was nothing visibly out of place. No sound carried on the cool morning air, except the gentle clatter of leaves. But Raven continued staring, her amber eyes fixed, her shoulders rigid. "You see something?" Edward murmured. The shepherd didn't move. This had been happening for 2 weeks. It started subtly, her wandering off further than usual, lingering near the quarry edge, circling the same patch of overgrown dirt, as if something beneath it called to her. Then it escalated. She began to dig. At first only for a few seconds at a time. But with each passing day she dug harder, longer, with growing desperation. The soft pads of her paws had scraped raw, and Edward had bandaged them twice already. He had scolded her at first, confused by the behavior. But he stopped when he realized she wasn't digging randomly. She dug in one exact spot, always the same place. He finished his coffee and set the cup down on the porch railing. Raven stood up immediately, ready before he even made a move to leave. She stayed at his heel as he walked toward the old quarry road, the gravel crunching under his boots. The air grew colder as they descended the slope, the scent of earth growing stronger. Raven moved ahead of him now, tail raised, following a path she knew by heart. The spot she led him to was near the deepest part of the quarry floor, close to a mound of dirt that sloped into a shallow trench. It looked no different from the rest of the abandoned terrain, patches of brown grass, cracked soil, scattered footprints from deer. But Raven knew. She always knew. She went to the same place every time, lowered her head, and sniffed the ground with slow, deliberate sweeps. Then she began to dig. "Raven." Edward's voice was steady. "That's enough." But she didn't stop. She dug harder, her claws raking into the earth, sending clumps of dirt flying behind her. Edward crouched beside her, his hand on her back. The muscles beneath her thick black coat trembled with effort. "Hey," he said quietly. "Hey, look at me." She stopped at the sound of command barely. Her chest rose and fell in heavy breaths. Dirt coated her muzzle. Her eyes met his, and he saw not fear, not aggression, but purpose. Pure, unwavering purpose. "What is it you're trying to tell me?" he whispered. She stepped back and nudged him toward the ground. It was gentle, but insistent. Edward dug with his gloved hands. The soil was cold and compacted, and he worked slowly, methodically. A few inches down, his fingers touched something hard. He paused, brushed more dirt aside, and exposed a flat piece of metal no bigger than his palm. Rusted, dented, but unmistakably part of something larger. He lifted it into the light. It was painted, that much he could tell, but the original color was difficult to determine beneath the rust. A faint line of white, maybe yellow, traced along one edge. Raven sat down, watching him, ears pointed forward. "That's what you found," he muttered. "Where's the rest of it?" His eyes drifted to the old crane. It rose at the far end of the quarry like a giant skeletal beast, its long arm extending toward the sky. He had assumed it was useless the first time he saw it. But something about the machinery seemed preserved. It didn't match the rest of the quarry's decay, as if someone had been taking care of it, or had used it not too long ago. Edward stood slowly, the piece of metal still in his hand. Raven followed him as he walked toward the crane, drawn by a sudden sense of urgency that made his heartbeat shift. The steps felt heavy, but inevitable. The closer he came, the more detail sharpened in his vision. The tracks beneath the crane seemed recently disturbed. There were marks, faint but visible compressed earth, displaced stone, something large having been moved. He climbed into the cab. The scent of dust and oil hung thick in the air, but the seat wasn't as weathered as he expected. The ignition key was still in place. He touched it, hesitated, then turned. The engine roared to life. He jerked back in shock, staring at the dashboard. The sound reverberated through the quarry like the growl of a waking animal. Raven barked once, startled but alert. "Someone's been using you," He whispered to the machine. But why? And for what? He looked back toward the spot Raven had been digging. The ground there was slightly sunken, as if something massive lay beneath it. A shape buried in the earth, invisible to the eye but not to Raven. Edward climbed out of the cab and walked the perimeter of the trench. He stepped carefully, studying the slope, testing the ground with his boots. It was loose in some places, compacted in others. It wasn't natural. It wasn't even consistent. The earth had settled, but not because of time, because of weight. A buried vehicle, something large. And Raven had sensed it before he ever came near. He knelt again beside her, resting a hand on her back. She leaned into him, steady, ready. "You want me to bring it up," he murmured. "Whatever it is under there. You want me to bring it out." Raven turned her head slightly, looking up at him with eyes that carried the same message he had once seen in soldiers who knew a threat was coming long before anyone else did. He stood, his decision already made. "All right," he said quietly, almost to himself. "We dig. We use the crane." As he began walking back toward the machine, Raven stayed close by his side. The land around them seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting, as if watching. The sun had climbed fully now, but the quarry remained in shadow, its silence heavy and expectant. Edward climbed into the cab once more, placed his hands on the controls, and steadied his breath. This wasn't the quiet life he'd come here for. Something was buried beneath his land, something Raven had fought to reveal. And now that he had seen the first glimmer of it, Edward Hartman knew one thing with absolute certainty. There was no turning back. He pulled the lever. The crane began to move, and the earth that had slept for years was about to wake. The engine of the crane groaned through the quarry like an awakening giant, echoing against the walls of stone, and unsettling the stillness that had hung there for years. Dust rose in trembling clouds as the old machine shifted on its tracks, each movement labored, but surprisingly steady. Edward sat inside the cab, adjusting the controls with both caution and certainty, his hands remembering motions he had not used in decades. Heavy machinery had been part of his life long before war had carved its mark on him, and some skills never faded. But there was something different now, something heavier than the weight of the crane's arm. The knowledge that he was not uncovering simple scrap metal, but something buried intentionally, something that Raven had sensed long before he understood the danger himself. She stood below, a black silhouette against the pale ground, watching him with a posture of complete focus. Her ears shifted constantly, taking in every vibration of the machine, every shifting tremor of the earth. She did not move closer to the digging site. Instead, she remained a few yards back, nose lifted slightly, as though she smelled something deep within the soil. Something hidden. Something wrong. Edward lowered the bucket into the earth, feeling the resistance as steel carved into hardened dirt. The first scoop broke cleanly, pulling up clumps of soil that tumbled down the sides of the trench. He swung the bucket aside and released it, the dirt sliding down in a dark cascade. Raven watched the falling soil with growing tension, as though waiting for something to emerge from beneath it. He felt her gaze even when he didn't look directly at her. He continued digging, each movement steady, each scoop deeper than the last. The trench slowly widened and deepened, exposing layers of compacted earth that had not seen daylight in years. Edward worked patiently, knowing that the weight hidden below could not be unearthed rashly. Whatever was down there required careful hands. He had no desire to collapse the soil and bury the truth further. After several minutes of digging, the bucket scraped against something harder than stone. The sound reverberated through the crane sharp, metallic, unmistakable. Edward froze. Raven let out a single low bark, her attention snapping to the trench. He lifted the bucket, let soil slide away. then lowered it more gently to probe the obstruction. Again, the metal groan rust scraping against steel. Not a boulder, not construction debris. Something manufactured, something large. He set the crane on idle and climbed down from the cab, boots hitting the ground with the weight of anticipation pressing against his chest. Raven met him halfway, tail down, body tense. "Show me," he murmured. She led him to the edge of the trench, stopping exactly where she had been digging days before. Edward knelt and brushed away loose soil with his hands, scooping it aside with slow urgency until the shape beneath became visible. A flat, rusted surface, curved slightly, streaked with age. He brushed more dirt, revealing a window frame. Shattered glass still clinging to the edges, fused by earth and time. He sat back in stunned silence. A bus. A full-sized, long-distance bus. Buried. Raven emitted a soft whine, nudging his shoulder, sensing the shift in him. Edward placed a hand on her neck, grounding himself through her steady warmth. His mind raced, connecting fragments of information, half-remembered news stories about a missing bus 15 years ago, a disappearance no one had ever explained. Families left without closure, investigations that led nowhere, a final assumption of natural disaster, though bodies had never been found. He looked at the dirt-packed windows, the rusted roof obscured by layers of soil, and he knew instinctively. This was that bus, and someone had buried it. He returned to the crane with a different kind of resolve. The digging was no longer cautious curiosity. It was excavation. Retrieval. Maybe even justice. He repositioned the machine, lowering the bucket with meticulous care, removing dirt from around the bus's frame to prevent collapse. Each scoop exposed more of the shape long, unmistakable, like a sleeping metal giant trapped beneath the earth. He cleared sections of the roof, revealing dents and scratches that ran across the metal in patterns that made his stomach tighten. Those marks were not made by rockfall or time. They were made by hands, by fists, by people inside trying to get out. He stopped the crane briefly, stepping out to inspect the marks more closely. Raven stayed glued to his side, tail stiff, as though she too understood the weight of the moment. The air felt colder, the quarry suddenly stiller. He traced the dents with gloved fingers, imagining the terror behind them, the struggle, the desperate hope of someone who believed help might come. But help never came. He resumed digging, clearing earth around the wheels, 4 massive ones on the driver's side, all deflated, all buried midway. He saw the faint outline of the bus's logo beneath rust and mud, and even that faint recognition made his breath catch. A company defunct for years, a route permanently closed. He paused only when the bus's entire length was visible beneath the surface. The machine towered above him, the crane's arm suspended like a judge's gavel over a moment of truth. He stepped back and studied the vehicle. Buried nose first, as though shoved into the ground. Dirt filled every gap, packed against windows and doors. He needed to lift it, raise it from the earth before the soil claimed it again. But lifting a 30-foot bus was no small task. He approached the crane once more, checking the cables stored on the back shelf. Thick, steel-coated lines designed for heavy loads. They were old but intact, likely the last remnants of the quarry's working days. He dragged them toward the trench, securing hooks beneath the exposed frame of the bus. It took long minutes to find anchor points that hadn't crumbled into rust. Raven lay at the edge of the trench, head resting on her paws, watching his every move. When he climbed back into the crane and powered up the lifting arm, he felt Raven's tension from across the quarry. The shepherd stood, pacing along the edge, her gaze moving from the bus to the tree line, as though expecting something or someone to appear. Edward tightened his grip on the controls. The crane's arm groaned, cables pulled taut, and the bus shuddered beneath the earth. Clumps of soil broke away from the sides, as the massive vehicle shifted for the first time in 15 years. The rattling echoed like distant thunder, each vibration carried through the ground. With a deep mechanical growl, the bus rose. Dirt surged downward, sliding off its sides in thick sheets. Mud-splattered windows broke apart, releasing wet soil that spilled over the quarry floor like dark water. Metal screamed as the frame lifted, scraping against rock layers it had long been pressed into. The smell of damp decay, trapped for over a decade, burst upward, a stench of mold, rust, and something older, something like death sealed in stale air. The bus dangled several feet above the ground, suspended by the crane's cables, dripping soil. Edward stared at it, chest tight. Raven let out a low growl, not at the bus, but at the forest behind him. Edward turned slightly. The trees were still, but the shadows between them looked wrong, too dense, too watchful. It wasn't paranoia. Raven's hackles were fully raised, her growl deepening into a warning. "Easy," he murmured, stepping off the crane's platform. But she didn't calm. Her body leaned forward, tail stiff, muscles taut. She wasn't afraid. She was ready. Edward scanned the area. The quarry was quiet, but quiet in a way that felt unnatural. The air lacked birdsong. Even the insects seemed silent. As he walked slowly toward Raven, he noticed something half-hidden near a rock, a cigarette butt, still fresh enough that the paper hadn't softened from dew. His pulse quickened. Someone had been here recently, maybe minutes before he arrived, and whoever it was had been close enough to see what he had uncovered. He crouched, picked up the cigarette butt with a stick, and studied it. A brand he recognized. Expensive. Not the type locals smoked. He tossed the stick aside and looked toward the forest again. Raven's growl grew louder. He felt eyes on him, watching, waiting. The bus remained hanging above the ground, swaying gently in the breeze. Its undercarriage was bent and twisted. Through the cracked windows, he saw hints of the interior shredded seat foam, straps torn from hooks, metal bars bent unnaturally. And deeper inside, in the gloom, he could see rows of seats caked with dirt, a child's toy half visible beneath mud, and what looked like hardened impressions on the glass handprints, preserved where they should never have been. He squeezed his eyes shut briefly. Someone had locked them in, buried them alive. Raven barked once, sharply, snapping him from the thought. He turned to her, and she immediately pressed her body against his leg, not out of fear, but in a protective stance, as though anchoring herself to him. All at once he felt the magnitude of what he had done, of what he had revealed. The truth was hanging from the crane's cables, exposed to the world at last, and someone, somewhere, did not want it exposed. The cigarette butt proved that someone already knew he had found the bus. The thought chilled him more deeply than the autumn air ever could. He walked back to the bus, needing to see more, needing to understand what he was dealing with. He climbed a few feet up one of the exposed wheels, then grabbed onto a piece of twisted metal to steady himself. Through a broken window, he saw the front section of the bus more clearly. The driver's seat was crushed against the dashboard. The steering wheel was bent inward, as though pressure had been applied from outside. Wires dangled like veins torn from a body. And next to the driver's seat, half buried in soil, was a glint of metal. He reached in, pulled at it gently until it came free. A badge. Or half of one. A police insignia broken cleanly down the middle, the numbers scratched, but readable. His heart kicked hard against his ribs. A police officer had been on the bus. The official reports from the missing route had mentioned nothing about an officer being present. Someone had erased the truth from the record. He climbed down, his breath tight, mind working through possibilities he had never prepared himself to face. Even as his thoughts spiraled, Raven remained beside him, never letting her guard down, her eyes fixed not on the bus, but on the dark tree line. He felt the weight of the badge in his hand and understood what it meant. Whatever happened here had been deliberate, orchestrated, covered up, and buried literally and figuratively. And now, by uncovering the bus, he had stepped directly into the path of whoever had done it. The air shifted behind him. Not a breeze, a disturbance. Raven snapped her head toward the movement so quickly that Edward felt the jolt run through his arm where he held her collar. Someone was there, in the woods, watching. He didn't see a figure, only the faint flicker of motion, but he didn't need to. Raven confirmed it with a growl that rose from deep inside her chest. She leaned forward, ready to defend if necessary. Edward placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "We're not alone," he whispered. The bus hung above them like an exposed wound, dripping earth, a monument to unanswered screams and unspoken truth. And the forest, once silent and indifferent, now felt alive with eyes he could not see. He pocketed the broken badge and stood beside Raven, the two of them united by a shared instinct that the danger was only beginning. He did not know who watched from the shadows, nor why they had returned now, but he understood one thing as clearly as the weight of the metal in his pocket. In raising the bus from the earth, he had awakened not only the dead, but the living who had tried to bury them, and those people would come back. They always did. The night pressed against the windows of the farmhouse like a dark, living thing, thicker and heavier than usual. Edward felt it the moment he stepped inside, an off-kilter stillness that seemed to seep into the walls, the air, even his own pulse. Raven stayed close to him, her steps silent on the worn floorboards, her tail lowered but stiff, her senses reaching beyond the fragile protection of the house. She had not relaxed since they returned from the quarry. Every few minutes, she would lift her head toward the back door, or toward the window, facing the tree line, as if she expected the darkness outside to take shape and walk toward them. Edward placed the broken half-badge on the table. The small piece of metal seemed to radiate its own presence, as though it carried the weight of everything it had witnessed before being buried. He expected it to feel cold, but his fingers felt heat where they had held it. Maybe the heat was his own. Maybe it was the pressure of knowing the truth, at least enough of it to understand that someone had buried the bus, the story, and every person on board. He ran his hands over his face and leaned both arms on the table. For years he had lived with the memories of war that clawed at him during sleepless nights. But those memories, dark as they were, belonged to the past, trapped in places far away. What stood outside now was danger that breathed the same air he did. It knew where he lived. It had already come close enough to leave traces. The cigarette butt in the quarry was the quiet signature of a watcher who preferred to stay hidden. Someone who did not need to approach yet. Someone who had time. Someone who believed Edward would not stop at uncovering the bus. Raven padded around the table and pressed her head into Edward's shoulder. He placed a hand on her flank, grounding himself in her steadiness. She was alert, but not afraid. She had faced danger before. She would face it now. Still, he felt the tension in her muscles, the readiness for something unseen. "You knew," he whispered. "Long before I dug." She didn't move, only breathed steadily against him. She had sensed the buried metal, the trapped stories, the wrongness in the earth. She had led him there because she understood danger in ways humans couldn't. And now she sensed the danger that watched from beyond the trees. Edward pushed himself upright. The house felt too small, too confining, as though any moment someone could strike the walls and force them inward. He walked to the window overlooking the quarry path. The darkness outside was quiet, but quiet only on the surface. He scanned the distance, memorizing the shapes of trees, the angle of shadows, the faint shimmer of moonlight on metal equipment. Nothing moved, but Raven's earlier tension lingered in his mind. If she sensed movement, it was real. He turned away from the window and studied the items he had taken from the bus. The half badge, a small toy figure caked in dirt, the plastic warped but still showing a smiling face. A frayed strap that once held emergency equipment. He remembered the seat rows, the dents in the metal, the desperate marks of hands clawing at windows. They had been alive for a while after the bus went underground. The thought tightened his chest. The suffering inside that sealed tomb was unimaginable. And someone had stood by and watched it happen. He wondered how long the passengers had survived before air ran out. He wondered whether the driver had tried to shield the others, or if he had been conscious at all. Fear didn't leave marks like the ones he saw on the doors. Terror did. Determination did. The desperate will to live did. He closed his eyes, the darkness behind his lids swirling with images he didn't want to see. When he opened them again, Raven was standing in the doorway, staring at him, as if reminding him of her presence, her partnership, her readiness. "You're right," he said quietly. "We can't stay here." But he didn't mean leaving the house. He meant something deeper. They couldn't stay silent. They couldn't pretend this was a discovery that would resolve itself. Whoever buried the bus would not let Edward walk away with the truth. Whoever watched them from the woods would return. He walked to the cupboard, where he kept an old metal box. Inside were items from another Life Dog tags, a worn map, a folded photograph of his unit, a knife he had carried through 3 deployments. He picked up the knife first, weighing it in his hand. It felt heavier now. Or maybe he had simply forgotten how real danger felt beneath the surface of peace. Raven watched the ritual silently, as though she understood he was gathering parts of himself he had locked away. He strapped the knife to his belt and stood for a moment in the dim light of the kitchen, letting the weight settle on him. Then he grabbed his flashlight and motioned to Raven. "We checked the quarry," he said. "If they came closer once, they'll come again." The night air hit him like a cold wave as he stepped outside. Raven moved ahead, but not far. Her training kept her within his reach at all times. Her ears swiveled constantly, listening to the forest that breathed around them. Edward scanned the tree line with his flashlight. The beam sliced through the dark, illuminating branches that moved only with the wind. But Raven's posture told him she sensed more than wind. She stopped abruptly at the edge of the yard, head low, tail horizontal, the stance of a predator guarding its territory. "What do you see?" he whispered. Her nose lifted, catching a scent he couldn't detect. She inhaled deeply, then let out a quiet rumble that vibrated through her chest. Edward followed her gaze. At first he saw nothing but overlapping shadows. Then his light caught something faint in the dirt, a series of impressions, barely noticeable, running parallel to the house. Boot prints, deep ones, fresh enough that the edges hadn't crumbled. He knelt and studied them. The pattern was clear. Heavy tread, high-end boots, not the cheap kind sold in rural hardware stores. These were worn by someone trained, someone who moved through wilderness with intention, not clumsiness. Someone who knew how to watch without being seen. Raven sniffed the prints and stiffened. She recognized the scent from the quarry. Edward trusted her instincts more than any tracking device. "He was here," Edward murmured, "close enough to touch the house." Raven's growl grew stronger, vibrating through the night air. Edward rose slowly. Behind them, the farmhouse loomed like a frail guardian. Ahead of them, the path to the quarry stretched like a dark invitation. He didn't hesitate. He moved toward the quarry, Raven beside him, silent except for the soft padding of her paws. The path was narrow and twisted, branches brushing against his arms as he walked. Owl cries echoed in the distance, But otherwise the night felt unnaturally still, as if something had ordered the forest to be silent. When they reached the quarry rim, Edward stopped. The crane stood motionless in the moonlight, tall and skeletal, its cable swaying slightly as the suspended bus dangled near the ground, like a corpse on a hook. The sight sent a cold shiver through him. In daylight, the bus had been shocking. At night, it was haunting. The hollow windows looked like eyes gouged out, staring at him with hollow accusation. Raven's posture changed. She lowered her body and moved forward with careful, deliberate steps, sniffing the ground in short bursts. She circled the crane once, then came back to Edward, staring up at him with a look he understood instantly. Someone had stood beneath the crane. Someone had touched it. The scent was fresh. Edward approached the crane cautiously. The air smelled faintly of diesel mixed with something else, something metallic and sharp, like the smell of gun oil. He flashed his light across the machine, searching for signs of tampering. One of the lower panels was slightly ajar. He crouched, pulling it back further with cautious fingers. Inside, wires had been cut. His breath caught. Someone had tried to disable the crane. Someone had planned to drop the bus back into the earth, or crush it before Edward could investigate further. Whoever it was had been interrupted, not by Edward, but by Raven. She had likely scared them off earlier when she barked. He stood slowly, anger building beneath his ribs. This wasn't a passive observer lurking in the woods. This was a threat acting with purpose, a threat trying to erase the evidence all over again. Raven barked sharply, the sound erupting into the quiet. Edward turned toward her just as she sprinted toward the tree line, teeth bared. He raced after her, flashlight bouncing wildly, heart thundering. He saw a shape, a dark blur slip between the trees ahead of them. Human. Fast. Moving with precision. Raven lunged after the figure, but Edward shouted her name instinctively. She skidded to a halt, inches, before disappearing into the deeper forest. He couldn't risk losing her, or running into an armed stranger alone. The figure vanished into the woods, feet silent on the dead leaves. Edward heard the faint rustle for a moment longer, then nothing. He exhaled slowly. Whoever it was had been close. Very close. Close enough to sabotage the crane. Close enough to watch Edward lift the bus. Close enough to know Edward was now a witness. He turned back to the quarry. The bus swayed gently on the cables, like a message suspended in midair. The broken badge in his pocket felt heavier now, like a piece of the past urging him forward. He approached the bus, Raven walking beside him. She was still tense, but she had returned to his side with absolute loyalty. He reached the open panel near the front and shined his light inside. A glimmer of metal caught his attention. Another panel, half buried in dirt. He reached in, pulling it free. It popped loose with a jolt. Behind it, wedged inside a small compartment, was a black box no larger than a brick. A recording module. His breath tightened. There were only two reasons such a module would be here. Either it had been installed by the bus company for monitoring purposes, or someone had installed it to record something specific. He studied it. The module was dented but intact. The label was scratched, but part of it remained readable. It belonged to a high-security manufacturing firm known for producing surveillance equipment, not typically used in public transportation. Someone on the bus had been recording, or someone outside the bus had needed evidence suppressed. Edward held the box firmly in his hands, feeling the weight of everything it represented. Raven stood beside him, leaning into his leg as though she sensed the gravity of the discovery. He looked up at the forest again, searching the darkness for the man who fled moments earlier. He wasn't visible, but Edward could feel him. Somewhere out there, hidden behind a wall of trees, someone watched with growing desperation. He slipped the recording module into his jacket, zipped it, and rested his hand briefly on Raven's head. "This isn't a mistake," he said quietly. "This was planned, and we're not supposed to know." Raven nuzzled his hand in response, her presence grounding him. Edward cast one more look at the bus, a suspended tomb of truth, and turned toward the farmhouse. He did not know where this path would lead, but one thing was certain. The bus had not been buried by the earth alone. It had been buried by human hands. And those same hands would not hesitate to bury him for uncovering it. As he walked back through the quiet night with Raven by his side, he felt a shift within himself. He had come to this land seeking peace, anonymity, and escape. But fate had handed him something else. A battle. One that demanded the same courage he had used long ago in distant lands. He stepped onto his porch and paused. The wind rustled through the trees like a whisper. Far away, an engine hummed faintly, fading into the distance. They would be back. But so would he. And this time, he would be ready. If you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe, watch the next video that has just appeared on your screen, and feel free to share this one with others.